Hey guys, it's Mike here, and in this video, I'm going to be reviewing Saw X, or Saw 10, I'm not quite sure which one I'm supposed to say, which is the, obviously, 10th entry in the Saw franchise of horror, thriller, mystery movies, in which we see the return one more time of Tobin Bell as Jigsaw. And along the way, we get to see a lot more backstory and delving into Jigsaw as a villain, as a character, and as a man, which I think overall ends up making for a really good movie and great entry into the Saw franchise, which I guess is actually really surprising when you think about it, because overall this is the 10th movie in the Saw franchise. And the truth of the matter is that the majority of the Saw movies kind of went down in quality over time. Now, for any of you guys who might not have seen it, on my channel, Laughingstock Cinema, I actually have a review, a marathon review, where I went in depth and watched every single Saw movie up until what was originally supposed to be the final chapter. Of course, it is a horror movie franchise, so every single time they say the final chapter, that means you're guaranteed more sequels. But with that being said, we also went on to see other movies after that, which I also reviewed Jigsaw on this channel, and then I finally got to see Spiral, which funny enough is a movie I was actually looking forward to. I mean, you had Chris Rock and Samuel L. Jackson in a Saw movie. Like, that writes itself. That sounds amazing. Oh, I got trapped in this motherfucking trap. I'm so sick of this shit. You know, like, it would be awesome. But the problem is it ended up being one of the worst Saw movies, if not the worst Saw movie in the franchise, which really goes to say a lot considering the one that came before that was also not very good, and most of the Hoffman-led Saw franchise isn't quite as good as what came before, with Amanda's led Saw franchise, which also wasn't quite as good as the first two, for me, which are the best two up until this point of the original Saw and Saw 2, which has always been my favorite in the franchise. But then we finally get into Saw 10. And honestly, going in, I set my expectations low and tried really not to have any at all, because who would think that the 10th entry in a franchise like this, which has basically just been run into the ground at this point, and they've tried time and time again to either reboot it or move in a different direction or whatever, would even be good. But the truth of the matter is that I ended up thinking that Saw 10 was actually a great entry in the franchise and one of, if not the best Saw movie ever made, which again is crazy because it is the 10th movie. Now, in terms of that, let's get into breaking down some of the details in the movie itself in terms of the cast, the direction, and that much more. So I'm going to pull that up right now, and we're going to get into that. So Saw 10 was directed by Kevin Grutart, which hopefully I'm getting that name right, written by Josh Stolberg and Pete Goldfinger. No, Mr. Bond, I expect you to die! Who had written the two previous Saw movies that came before this, which honestly weren't anywhere near as good as this one. And of course, once again, it stars the returning John Kramer, Tobin Bell, who has done a great job in this franchise up until now. He's always really been the highlight of the franchise up until right now in terms of his acting. And this movie really takes that to the next level, because the truth of the matter is that in terms of Jigsaw and what we see, typically the way that these movies are constructed is around the individuals who are being put in these Saw traps. They are the ones who have to endure the various things that happen along the way. Maybe we'll get a little bit of their backstory and stuff divvied out throughout the course of the film, leading up to or during the course of their different Saw games that they're taking part of. However, in this movie, John Kramer is front and center. This is basically John Kramer, the Saw movie, which is all about him. We get way different format and structure than any of the other Saw movies leading up to this. Whereas, like I said before, they'll usually like break it up over the course of a movie, make it more of like a general mystery. In this movie, it plays out in way more of a chronological order, in which we see everything leading up to the events of John Kramer, putting the individuals who wronged him into different Saw games. In this one, as you guys might have seen in the trailer, what happens is that John Kramer is scammed. There are these evil people who end up taking him for his money, pretending that they're going to heal him and remove his cancer. And then what ends up happening is that they lied. They were just scamming him, trying to make money off of him, and he is going to get his revenge. And this is the movie that really makes you sympathize the most with John Kramer, probably out of every other movie, aside from the one where they revealed that he had his child die before he was born because the whole situation that happened, which you guys could check out me talking more in depth about in my marathon review. But nonetheless, the fact of the matter is that you really feel for him, despite the fact that you know he does these horrible things, and that really, as in most of the other movies, his type of morality and the way that he does some of the things is quite questionable along the way, as well as the fact that, you know, one of the biggest problems I would say that I have about this movie is in relation to saw traps, which I'll get into shortly. But fact of the matter is they do a great job with not only making you empathize for John Kramer and understand exactly why he's going to do this to these people, but also making you hate the people that did this. Like, by far the most loathsome villain in the franchise is Synnøve Mikundi Lund as Cecilia Peterson, who is by far one of the most vile characters, if not the most vile character in the entire franchise up until this point, which is really saying a lot, considering the fact that there have been people of all different horrible reputes and backgrounds and things along the way. But this woman here puts them all to shame with the horrible things she does, scamming people and leading them into thinking they have hope when they're on the verge of death, and taking their money and everything that she does to John Kramer along the way. And really, during this movie, you just cannot help but root for him to get her and to get everything with her. And even though I would say that the way that they resolve her character and everything at the end is questionable, and also it kind of leaves you wondering about this and that, the fact of the matter is that by the time the Saw game begins, you are way more receptive to what Jigsaw is going to do to these people because of how horrible they are and their monstrous actions that they unleash upon the characters, which, again, this movie is all about kind of building up John Kramer, his story, everything he's going through, and making you empathize. And like I said before, Tobin Bell gives an amazing performance here, which is really like basically the great scene from Saw 6 where he's talking to the insurance agent and saying, like, this is why everything is going so terrible here, and kind of lecturing them, basically turned up to like 100, because it's like half the movie is like that. And maybe at some points you can argue it's a little bit preachy, or maybe you can argue that perhaps it might be a little heavy-handed, but the fact of the matter is it's executed so well with regard to Tobin Bell and his backstory and everything leading up to it, and it's handled in a structure that's completely different from all the Saw movies, where everything develops in a more like movie format, to where like I'm watching the movie, I'm like, this feels like a real movie rather than like a exploitation Saw movie, to where you end up really liking it, and it ends up, because of that, being one of the best movies in the franchise up until this point. Whether you want to say it's the best one, you could definitely argue that, but overall I do think I'll save that for later in the video, so you guys keep watching. Now, during this movie, we also see the return of some big popular characters from throughout the course of the films, with of course Amanda returning one more time and serving a prominent role in the film, which was revealed in the trailers, in which we actually do get to see her taking part in this. And this movie, in terms of the timeline, seems to be a prequel to Saw 3 at the very least. It might take place before the original Saw movie, you know, maybe between this and Jigsaw, and also it might take place, you know, maybe even after, I don't know, the first or second movie. It's left ambiguous in that sense, but so too is what's going to happen after this movie. Because in terms of this movie and the timeline, there really is a question of whether or not this actually is going to still be following all of the previous movies. Now, I had assumed so up until this point, that it would be a part of the same series, that it all interconnects, and it's still a part of the very same storyline, where a lot of people might kind of think like, well, Saw probably doesn't have that kind of complex of a story. You guys probably haven't seen all of them, because they all are interconnected and weave together in that sense. So I would assume going into the movie that's the case, but the way that the movie ends almost kind of leaves it up to where they might just be like, you know what? who cares? Let's just move forward with a different continuity with the same characters and let things play out slightly differently. And like I said before, I do think that overall it probably takes place in the same continuity as the other movies, at least, 3 onward. There is a chance it won't, and we'll have to see where it goes, especially with the way the movie ends, which does leave it open and is not conclusive in that sense. Although with the ending, I will say it does feel a little abrupt because most of the Saw movies usually do have more finality with the way that the end. But with that being said, again, I feel like it is setting itself up for another film to come. With that being said, though, Tobin Bell at this point in time definitely is older than when he started the series, and he wasn't quite young at that time either. With him now being in his 80s at the age of 81, and you can notice during the movie that Shawnee Smith, who plays Amanda, is looking a little bit older than she did in the original trilogy, of course, or the original trilogy was a Star Wars in the original movies. But with that being said, you could say the same thing about Better Call Saul and how Bob Odenkirk and all the actors looked older there as well, and yet it still ended up being great and their performances weren't hampered. I think a lot of the time that people are more willing to suspend their disbelief for actors being older than they are with CGI or somebody else replacing them or something like that, because the fact that we still know it's the same actors, we could still get the same performances out of them. And to be fair, not all the acting is great here in this movie. It is what you would come to expect a lot of times from the Saw films. Tobin Bell gives a great performance. The other performances are mixed at best because, this isn't a movie that you really go for acting performances or anything like that. But at the end of the day, what I will say is that I think that they handled this movie well. And another thing I would have to praise about it is the cinematography. This is probably the best cinematography that I can remember from any of the Saw movies. The direction overall from Kevin Grutart was really good. And he actually was a director on Saw 6. But in terms of this, I think he did a way better job in terms of his direction in this movie comparative to then. And you could see that he definitely got better over the course of time in this franchise. Now, with that being said, I guess I could say overall that perhaps my biggest weakness for this movie is actually the saw traps themselves, because even though the saw traps do serve a good story purpose, where the saw traps themselves each kind of have like an ironic twist to them, in a sense to where like each of the victims that are taking a part in them, for the most part, will be factored into where they are given their just desserts in a due way. A lot of them do seem kind of almost toned down from the earlier Saw movies. Like the first Saw trap we see, first off, we don't really know if it actually happened or if it was like just in John Kramer's imagination, but like it's like the easiest Saw trap ever, where the guy just has to break his fingers or he dies. And it's kind of like, well, yeah, just do it. Like, what the hell are you waiting for? And yet he can't do it. And there are so many of the Saw traps in this movie where it's like, they don't have enough time to actually do the trap, like to actually play the game. And so as a result, you're watching these characters and it's like, why didn't you give them like a couple more minutes? Like, especially the ones that basically go through the entire thing and yet they still die. It's kind of like, well, what's the point of this? Like you saw that they showed that they have the will to live, but they died anyway. So it's like, at that point, it's basically like John Kramer, again, kind of like tying into that morality of his, is basically just straight up killing these people because the fact that he literally does not give them enough time to actually survive the traps in the first place. And then, his plan, it also kind of factors into these people failing anyway, because like if all the people succeeded, well, it would be kind of hard for him to like succeed with this plan too. And the fact too is that one of the things I will say about that is I actually really like that this movie did examine a little bit of that. Like they actually did reflect on John Kramer and Jigsaw and his plans, and how like sometimes it doesn't really necessarily line up with the terms of his morality, how things work out. And not just that too, but also the fact that like one of the things I like about this is that they acknowledge the fact that not everything can and always will go according to plan. Murphy's Law in action, right? So as a result, there are things where John Kramer does not get everything 100% right, or where things kind of go awry. Certainly he is like the criminal mastermind, and they show just how intelligent he is. For example, when he triangulates a location just based upon seeing something, and the fact that they explain a little bit more about how he sets up the traps and stuff. But not just that, there are times where it's like, well, things didn't go exactly according to plan, but they're still falling into place. So I do like that, and I do like that 10 movies in, they are being self-aware, but in a way that works rather than just like winking at the audience. So in terms of the overall negatives with the movie, I definitely think the pros outweigh the cons by far with this film, and it ends up being one of the best Saw movies ever made. Now, in terms of where this ranks according to the other Saw movies in the franchise, according to the IMDb score, we currently have a 7.4 on this one, whereas the original Saw movie has a score of 7.6, and Saw 2, my favorite one, has a 6.6, which I honestly think is too low. So in terms of all these, I definitely think that this ranks among those top 3 films. In some ways it's better, because this is easily the most emotional Saw movie, for instance, the most relatable in a sense, to where you see John Kramer and you understand way more about why he's doing what he's doing, the best directed one perhaps, and also not just that, but one that's structured differently from almost every other Saw movie in the franchise. So I could see why a lot of people would say this is maybe the best one, especially for like a casual moviegoer. It's also one that doesn't really require as much knowledge going in. It's almost like a standalone movie. Like going in, having seen all the previous films, you understand way more of what's going on, but at the same time, you don't actually need to watch any of the other Saw movies from what I can think of to follow this movie and what's going on. You might wonder who's Amanda, or who is this other person, or etc., etc. But when you watch the movie, you could do it either way and still walk away enjoying it and getting the overall message of the film. In terms of where it ranks, I guess I probably still would say that the first and second one might be better overall, just because the fact that like the Saw games, like I said before, aren't necessarily as strong as some of the ones in those two. The twist itself isn't necessarily as big as those two, or like as shocking in some ways, but you know, it definitely is that big Saw twist where the awesome music, Hello Zeb plays, and you know, the like it always is great when that happens. You know, you almost watch the movies at some points for that one scene. But the fact of the matter is that overall, this is really good in general, and one of the movies I probably have enjoyed the most this year, which I wasn't expecting to say from the 10th Saw movie in the franchise, and one that I would recommend for horror fans and people looking for a movie like this, Saw fans especially. All right, guys, so that is my review of Saw X, otherwise known as X Gonna Give It To You. What do you guys think? Let me know your own thoughts down below in the comments. Also, if you're new here, consider subscribing and enabling all notifications, that way you can stay up to date with all my future videos. Thanks for watching, and make sure to stick around, because there's a lot more to come in the future, assuming I don't get put in a Saw game. But hey, I'm not dumb enough to die. Well, I guess we'll find out in the future.
Yeah, and you better subscribe.